This is Tips for Travellers. Inspiration, advice, and tips on finding and having amazing travel experiences on both land and at sea. Get more tips on must-see and must-do travel at tipsfortravellers.com.
Well, hi, I'm Gary Bembridge, and here I am with another episode of Tips for Travellers. This is another of the live series. So these are episodes that I record day by day when I'm on a trip, and I try and capture observations and tips related to the whole journey and the whole experience. So it's a slightly different format. Here I am, actually, I'm lying on the bed in my cabin on a CroisiEurope River cruise boat, and we're docked in Nantes in France, and I'm about to go on a 5-night, 6-day cruise along the Loire River. And across the course of this episode, I'll be telling you much more about the Loire River and the places we go, etc. But really what I'm going to do in this setup is just run through a little bit about the cruise, tell you a little bit about CroisiEurope, and some of the things that have struck me already. So CroisiEurope is actually the largest river cruise operator in Europe. They've been going for over 40 years. They were established right back in 1976 by a man called Gerard Schmitter, and the family still own and run the business. And they have over 44 ships, the largest fleet in Europe. And they have huge amounts of choice, as you would expect. So they do the obvious ones like the Rhine and the Danube. They also do the Seine, they do the Rhone, they do rivers in Hungary, in Portugal, in Spain, and they also do the Loire. And what's interesting about the Loire is it's a very difficult river for river cruises to go on. It apparently gets very shallow. So they've designed a very specific ship, and the ship I'm on, which is called the Loire Princesse, is this ship. And the ship has, paddles. The old, if you imagine the old steamer paddles that used to go up and down the Mississippi, but they've adapted that concept, and they have paddles on either side of the ship, sort of in the center of the ship, which means that the draft of the ship is very shallow because there's no engines underneath, and it's also designed at the top to all the structures on the top can be taken down so it can actually get under very low bridges. So it's a very unique and distinct ship, and it's also quite a new ship. What's also important to note about CroisiEurope is, on the rivers of Europe are lots of luxury lines, and those of you who've listened to my podcast before will know I've travelled on some of them. But CroisiEurope is positioned much more as a value for money line, so they're significantly cheaper than some of the premium lines, and they basically then focus on one of the things I'm going to look at during the course of this series is what do they do differently in order to make it a value for money line. But even though they are a value for money line, they are also all-inclusive. So that's one of the ways that they also sort of position themselves, I guess, as all-inclusive. So, obviously your accommodation's included, you get unlimited drinks, so that includes things like beer and wine, spirits, bottled water, soft drinks, coffee, that kind of stuff. Obviously all your meals, and I'll talk about the meals as we go through the cruise, because the meals, they really talk about being French and French cuisine, so I'll talk about those as I experience those. You also get free Wi-Fi, which I've used. It's really good. It's very fast, which is great, and I guess that'll also depend how strong it is as you pass through the different terrain, so I'll keep you posted on that. But certainly the Wi-Fi is free. You get television on. There's onboard television with not that many channels, a couple of channels, some news channels, that kind of stuff, and a little bit of entertainment as well. What you do not get included, though, you do not get excursions included. So if you go on some of the more premium lines, their all-inclusive will include things like excursions. So there is actually one, from what I can see so far, one excursion that's included, but you can buy packages of excursions. So you can actually buy a package that includes all the excursions or various permutations or individual excursions. So as we go through the course, I'll talk a little bit more about the excursions, the price, that kind of stuff. But what they then do to achieve value for money is take excursions out. So that also means that people can choose not to spend money to go on excursions and can self-explore. The great thing about a river cruise is you normally dock right near the centre of town on river cruises, which also means that you can go off and explore the towns yourself. And in fact, the couple that I'm sitting at the table with, they don't take any excursions. The husband has limited mobility, so they prefer to just go out and do a bit of their own exploring. But obviously, they also talked about it does also save them some money. The other thing that I did notice in terms of value for money is the food. Certainly, I've only had one meal so far, but it was a great meal. But what I also noticed versus some of the more premium lines is you don't get a choice of dishes. So you don't get a choice of starters, of main courses, etc. You just get a set menu, but you do get a 3-course menu for dinner, 3-course menu for lunch, and there's a buffet breakfast. So for dinner this evening, we had a terrine to start, a very nice terrine. Then we had some veal with vegetables and a raspberry cake, and then you could also have, coffees, etc. afterwards. But you didn't get a choice. I'm assuming, of course, if you're vegetarian, you just let them know, and you'd obviously get the vegetarian option. So let me talk a little bit through some initial observations of CroisiEurope and some of the sort of information and fact that I've gained so far. So I actually had a transfer from the airport. So I flew in from Gatwick into Nantes in France. It's a relatively short flight from the UK. It's just about an hour actually. And then it's only about a 15-minute, maybe 20-minute at a push commute from the airport to the ship. So that's great. Also, it's great because we end back here, so it's going to be very easy to get back to the airport. And actually, I've got quite a nice early flight heading back because obviously I can get off the flight, get off the boat, and it's not that far to the airport. Arrived at the boat, lots of staff waiting, very friendly. There's kind of grabbed my bags, took them on board, and friendly staff to greet me. What's important is CroisiEurope is largely French, so a lot of the crew are French speakers. However, English is spoken extensively, and actually we have a group of Spanish on board, but they have they have a dedicated Spanish person to deal with those. But most of the people I've met so far have been French, although I've also met a guy from Hungary, from Budapest, who actually showed me to my room, who actually admitted he didn't speak any French at all, so he mostly speaks English, Hungarian. So I guess one of the things that, although French is predominantly, pretty much everyone speaks English on the ship from the crew perspective. I think the only person who doesn't is actually the first captain so far that I've come across. And but also they speak many other languages, so it's clearly designed to be very multilingual. Certainly the passenger mix, I would say, is there's probably about 100 passengers on board, because river ships are quite small. They tend to only take anywhere between 50 and 120 anyway, because they are limited by size. This ship, I think, is probably about 100 people. I'm guessing probably about 80 people are French, from what I can see. There's about 12, 15 English speakers with a mixture of Australians, people from the UK, some people from the US, and then there's that Spanish contingent. They seem to be the three nationalities so far that I've come across, and there may be others, but certainly in the introductory talk they did it in French and in English. So as I mentioned, when I arrived, it was very clear that French was the predominant thing, but people very quickly clicked into English, very friendly, greeted me, showed me to my cabin. It's great because these ships are small, they kind of know who's coming. There's not a big complicated check-in process, and because it's all inclusive, it's all paid up front. They're not taking things like your credit card and all that sort of stuff, so it's very easy. You don't need all these complicated security cards because people know who you are. They can recognize you straight away. I wasn't sure what to expect from a value for money line, and I wasn't sure about the quality of the ship, but I was very impressed. As I mentioned earlier, it's quite a new ship. It's very comfortable. It's not as plush as some of the premium lines as you'd expect, but the room certainly is very comfortable. It's clean, it's bright, it's relatively small. What I really like about it is there's two beds, together, looking out onto the river, so they're pointing to the river. Great little balcony, which I didn't have on other river cruise ships that I've been on. There's pretty good storage around the cabin. The bathroom has a shower, toilet obviously, and a basin. There's complimentary toiletries. There's a big bottle of water, and there's very good, there's air conditioning, and it's really comfortable. And obviously the test will be, how well I sleep in it. But certainly, as I said, I'm lying on the bed here and it seems very comfortable. Being a river cruise boat, there's not huge amounts of public spaces. There's the sort of lounge bar area, which was very nicely done. Very simple decoration, but very comfortable. Lots of sofas. There's a very friendly staff again, where you can get your drinks and coffees and things. And then the restaurant again. It was a great restaurant. Lots of tables, and what was quite nice actually, the tables were, it looked like different permutations, but between 4 and 6. And what I really, really liked about it, and again, it's probably because of the multilingual side, is when I've been on river cruises before, it's sort of open seated dining. Dinner starts at 7 and sort of ends at 9, but you kind of go in to dinner. But what they've done here is you're allocated a table which you will have for the duration of the trip, and I really like that. I'm traveling on this by myself, so they've allocated, I guess, based on language speaking. So I'm with another couple from the UK. I've noticed other tables are mixtures of people from the UK, people from Australia. So they've kind of grouped people together based on their language. And I really like that, because when I've been before, particularly traveling as myself, is you kind of have to go into the restaurant and sort of, trying to work out where you're going to sit and ask people, can you join them? And they've taken that all out. I mean, obviously I'm going to be sharing the table with the same people for the whole time, but that's fine. And I really like the fact that I've got that security to know that sort of stress of going to try and figure out where I'm going to be sitting and who I'm going to be sitting with. So this evening we had a welcome drinks and an introduction at 7:15. The official check-in time was between 6 and 7 on the ship. When I arrived about 6:05. Most people seemed to be here. We had the introductory talk, which I've already mentioned, was in English and French. They introduced all the crew. There's about 25 crew, so there's a very high, crew to passenger ratio. There's obviously chefs, there's waiting staff, there's obviously technician people, there's the captain, obviously, bar staff. There's actually a lady who plays the piano and does the entertainment side. So the whole gamut of people, but certainly a very high passenger to crew ratio, and I'm guessing probably about the same as when I've been on those sort of premium lines. Wi-Fi I've already mentioned, which is great. It's been very good. It's a no smoking ship. There is some space outside on the sun deck where people can go. The other thing, and I'll talk about it perhaps more when I get on to the excursions, is like the premium lines, they also on the excursions use those audio devices. So basically, the little the guide has talks into a microphone, and then you have a little radio mics or radio receivers, should I say, so you can actually walk away, take pictures, and hear all the commentary. So I think that's a really nice touch. Obviously tomorrow I'll find a little bit more in terms of how they structure the excursions. I'm assuming they'll do some French and some English, and I guess some Spanish. And so now I'm going to tell you about the second day of the trip down the Loire. And before I do that, I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the ship itself, the Loire Princesse. It was named and went into service officially on the 2nd of April 2015 in Nantes. It was built the year before that in 2014, or I guess they started building it in Saint Nazaire, which is actually a place that we visited today. And Saint Nazaire, as I'll talk about a bit later, is a very significant and important shipbuilding venue. It's weighs 700 tons, it has 48 cabins, it takes 96 passengers, and has 24 members of crew. So the crew to passenger ratio is very high indeed. It's a very attractive looking ship, and that's partly because the things like the dining room is on the bottom of the ship. Often with other cruise ships, river cruise ships, I've been on there higher up. And what they've done is put lots of more balcony cabins on the first level. So you have the sun deck, then you have the first level, and then underneath it you have rooms with sort of just large windows. But definitely I think it's an attractive looking ship, and obviously you can look on the blog and so on for more pictures of what it looks like and videos and all that kind of stuff. River itself, the Loire, is, as I discovered today, the longest river in France, which I didn't know before heading off on this cruise. It's just over 1,000 kilometers long, and only part of it is navigational by large maritime ships, and that really changes in Nantes, which is where we docked, and that's dates right back even to the Middle Ages, where there was a bridge, and that's still where the bridge kind of exists today, which ships could sail up towards. But then after that, they had to use very sort of narrow, flat-bottomed boats because there was lots of sandbanks, which would also shift a lot apparently, which made it very difficult to take larger ships up. And what I also discovered is Nantes used to be, used to be an important port and also an important centre for shipbuilding. But as ships started to get bigger and bigger, that was moved, down, right the way back down the river to Nazaire, which I, as I said, I'm going to talk about a little bit later. We also visited today. So let me run you a little bit through the day, and then I'll give you some highlights. Basically, at 7:30 this morning, the announcement went through the ship. So our announcements are made through the ship, but they're made in the corridor public areas. And then in your room, you have speakers, which you can either switch off or switch on. And if you switch them on, you'll hear whatever announcements are made in your room. The announcements are made in French and in English. And I guess separately, the Spanish guests are told what's happening. So the first announcement was at about 7:30. There was an 8 o'clock departure breakfast between 7 and 9, buffet breakfast. And what happened on the coaches this morning for the optional tour of Nantes was there was one coach which was for French, and then the other coach which was for the Spanish and English guests. And there was a guide, a Spanish guide and an English-speaking guide. Not many of the English-speaking people went, so there was only 5 of us actually on the English group, so it was a very nice small group. And we toured around Nantes until about 11:45, and at 11:45 we then came back to the ship. And I'll talk about some of the highlights of Nantes, which was a great surprise. I discovered on the tour that it's the 6th largest French city. It's got a population of about 690,000. It used to be France's largest slave trading port, and there's a big memorial building towards the slave trade and everything that kind of went on with that. And also we did explore and found out quite a lot about the slave trading at some of the places that we toured, which was pretty interesting. It's a very green city, and there's a line actually which is painted green around the city, which actually, if you follow, takes you around all the major sites that you can see. But basically what we did is we went on a walking tour. So the bus took us, dropped us off, and then we went on a walking tour. We went to a very beautiful square which has an absolutely gorgeous opera house. And then we kept walking through all these very beautiful buildings, and we visited a shopping complex which was called Passage Pommeraye. Beautiful, beautiful place with gorgeous ceilings, statues, clocks, stairways, etc. And again, on the side, if you go to Tips for Travellers and search either Nantes or even search Loire or CroisiEurope, you'll find links to some pictures of that. Absolutely, absolutely beautiful. We then also went and toured through the cathedral, which is called the Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul, a magnificent building, very impressive, huge, high ceilings, beautifully restored. We heard about how they had lost a lot of the stained glass windows in an explosion at the castle, which had reverberated and broken all the windows years back in the 1800s. But they've been replaced. It's an absolutely magnificent, magnificent building. We then also went to the Place Royale, which has a St. Nicholas Church behind it, but a magnificent fountain in the centre. And then we went to the castle. Now, the official name of the castle is the Castle of the Dukes of Brittany, and it's the last castle along the river before it actually reaches the ocean. And it's got beautiful 15th century and 17th century buildings. Really, absolutely magnificent, fascinating. And there's a lot of exhibitions and history within the castle that you can explore. And that's where we learnt a lot about the slave trade, for example. Anyway, we then headed back. And by the way, if that was, as I mentioned, that's an optional tour. The tour cost, if you were just buying that individually based on the optional excursions list that I've got, would be around €50. But you can also book a whole package which bundles all the different excursions together. And the one that was last night, which was the cruise on the Loire River, would have cost €37. So we got back to the ship. We had lunch, which was very tasty. There was pasta, salmon and nougat ice cream. Again, choice of wines, as I mentioned before, in terms of what's included in the fare, and it's all inclusive is wines, choice of white wines, red wines, rosé wines. The little gift shop that opened for about half an hour, and one of the things we were doing when all this was going on is we had set sail, and then we eventually docked, and we got off the boat, those who were going on the tour, to the Saint Nazaire shipyards, etc. The rest of the people, they sort of stayed on, and the ship then sailed off and met us at Saint Nazaire. So what we then did is we headed off on the excursion, and again, just looking at the price, it would have cost €71, this excursion, about 4 hours and 30 minutes. It was about a 20-minute drive to Saint Nazaire. And first of all, we went to a really remarkable exhibition, museum, I guess it's a museum really, which is called the Escale Atlantique. And what the Escale Atlantique does is it's called the liner experience, and it basically tells you the history of French ocean liners with the most amazing experience. Now, the actual museum itself and exhibition is within, I guess, what must have been some sort of dry dock, but it's sort of inside, so there's water going in it, and it's this massive big sort of warehouse building. It looks kind of just a big concrete block from the outside. But what happens is when you go in, it transports you into the Normandy liner, and they've recreated the sense of liner. In fact, it's eerily real at some points, that actually one of the people on the bus said, they kind of felt that it was almost like the original ship that had been chopped up and put, you were actually walking through in this building. But they've recreated corridors, hallways. You go out effectively onto the back of the ship, and they've got this massive projection onto a wall of what you would have seen. They've got the same thing with the promenade, where you get a massive projection onto the wall, which is some distance away actually, and there's water underneath it as well. And the weather changes. You go through and you see recreations of cabins. You go through the engine room, and then you go in and watch a film which tells you basically how the liner business grew and then declined with the growth of the airlines. And then to leave the museum, when you leave that film, which is about 6 minutes long, you actually get into lifeboats on the lifeboats on the deck, and you get lowered down, and then you come off, walk through, and go into the gift shops. It's a magnificent museum, the Escale Atlantique, Saint Nazaire. It's a real must-do, especially for someone like me who loves cruise ships. We then went on a guided tour of the Saint Nazaire shipyard. Now, they were very strict on that. It was a bus tour. We only got off at one point, which I'll talk about in a second, but you couldn't take any photo, any video. It's monstrous. It's 267 acres. And I personally found it quite interesting, but I don't know if everyone would find it interesting. But they basically talk about the process of building a cruise ship. But the really great part was when we went, got out the bus and walked to the dry docks where they're building ships. And they're building a massive new MSC ship and a massive new Royal Caribbean ship. The MSC ship's going to have, I think, about 5,000 guest capacity. And the Royal Caribbean one's even bigger than that. These are absolutely massive and being built in the dry docks, and you could see them up fairly close. It's frustrating you couldn't take any pictures. The MSC one was going to be delivered early next year, and the other one has still got about an 18-month build to go. And they also explained then how the various dry docks get flooded to sail the ships out, or actually get flooded to take it from one part of the dry dock into another part of the dry dock, which is deeper, so that they can then carry on building these ships. And they explain how they build these prefab blocks, massive big prefab blocks, which weigh many hundreds of tons, which then get lifted in and connected. Really, I mean, for me, it was really, really interesting. We then returned to the ship just after 6 o'clock, which by now is docked in Saint Nazaire, actually just behind the Escale Atlantique museum. It's not a particularly nice place we docked. It's sort of a bit of a harbour thing. It's not particularly picturesque. And we docked here until midnight, when we then set sail, and we're going to be sailing for about 11, 12 hours to our next stop tomorrow. A couple of other things. So a very busy day, very tiring day, lots going on. A couple of other things that that I picked up during the day that I thought would be interesting to share. Just thinking about, how do they make, value for money? How do they keep costs under control that they can offer good value? One of the things that's interesting is there's no daily program. The daily program is obviously announced, but then on the television on Channel 91 is the only way you get hold of the daily program. There's no, they're in print and all that sort of stuff, and have the process. I've already mentioned as well that drinks are included, and actually there's a menu in the bar which shows what is included and what isn't included. So to give you a sense of that, so you, in terms of you've got things, a couple of choices of beers, bitters, then things like port, martini, Campari, whiskey, gin, vodka, lots of alcohol-free drinks, Pepsi Light, lemonade, all that sort of stuff. Then you get your wines, which I've spoken about before, coffees, but you can also get things like cognac, brandy, and a whole different selection of brandies. But then there are other things that you can pay for. So if you wanted things like liqueurs, like a Bailey's or a Grand Marnier, or a cognac VSOP, or certain very sort of premium wines, or you wanted something like Malibu or Glenfiddich or Jack Daniel's whiskey, you'd pay. And so, for example, a Jack Daniel's would be €6, Malibu would be €4, a Bailey's would be €5, and then they also sell champagne. But I suspect most people stick with the kind of the things that are complimentary and included. The other thing which struck me is of the guests who were not French, the English-speaking guests that I've spoken to do seem to be Francophiles. So, for example, my table companions that I had for dinner love France. They always had been holidaying in France, and had now sort of progressed onto CroisiEurope as a way of seeing more parts of France. I met an American lady, and she was there with a group of Americans. I was sitting on the bus, actually, we went on the tour of Saint Nazaire, and discovered she used to be a French teacher, and she's got French colleagues who she knows from America that she was traveling with. So at the moment, it did seem there was a real sort of passion about France and traveling on France. The other thing that I've noted, and I knew anyway from the packing thing, is it's pretty informal dress code. People don't get dressed up for dinner. Sort of jeans are fine. Sort of polo shirts, even t-shirts and stuff. So it's relatively casual dress at all times. So that was the day today. After dinner this evening, which we had a niçoise salad, we had roasted veal and a tiramisu with a cheese in between the two, and that was all very tasty. One of the things that I did probably note, and I guess it makes sense with flexibility, is I suspect that the desserts are not made on the ship. They're bought in advance. Certainly that's based on the first 2 nights, and I guess it makes sense because they have relatively small kitchens. They don't have huge amounts of staff, so clearly like the salads all made fresh, and the main courses are clearly all prepared, and the vegetables and that kind of stuff. And the desserts, I guess, are brought in. They've been very tasty and delicious so far. This evening, there's a music quiz going on in the bar when I talk, as I record this. Then we set sail at midnight tonight. And so as day 3 comes to a close, I'm going to share with you some observations, thoughts, and things that happened today. So we set sail sometime after midnight. I was asleep at that point, but was sort of awoken as, I guess, the movement, etc., happened. And apparently it was sort of quite a loud kickoff. And I later discovered when we had a wheel tour that there was a very strong tide, and of course those paddle wheels that we have either side actually don't go very deep, and so the captain really had to sort of put his foot down, as it were, to make sure that we could safely sort of move away and start on our journey. But basically we sailed from just after midnight until around about 10 o'clock, and so quite a long stretch. So that was sailing all the way to Ensens, I think that's how you pronounce it, and that's what I heard people saying, so that's what I'm sticking with. So basically, up in the morning and had breakfast, and one of the things that was offered was a wheelhouse visit to go and meet the captain and sort of look at the technology. And I'm glad I did it. It was really interesting. It felt much more high tech than some of the other river cruises that I've been on, and this is as I've already mentioned, a pretty new ship, so I guess it's got some of the newest technology. What I did discover, a couple of things that were interesting, is there is only one person on board the ship that can basically sail it, and that's the captain. And so he was up pretty much all night. Well, not pretty much all night. He was up all night, sailing us to our stop. A couple of things I discovered is that, and I've mentioned a couple of times, but the Loire Princesse is the only large ship of any kind, not only river cruise, but of any kind, that comes this far up the Loire River, because it is so narrow, and that's why it's been designed as it is, to basically get all the way up. It can actually go in water that can be as shallow as 70 centimeters, although as I discover later, that can still be an issue, but more on that a little bit later. So we basically arrived at this very pretty town, and we docked right in the centre of town, as you tend to do with river cruises, and a lot of people strolled out, had a look around, and basically checked things out before it was time for lunch. Lunch was a buffet lunch, and then after the lunch was the excursion, and the excursion was called the Muscadet region, and it was about a 5-hour trip. It would have cost €50 if you were buying it individually. Again, there was a French group, which was one bus, and then the English and Spanish groups were on another bus. And first of all, we headed off to a place called Clisson. And Clisson was absolutely magnificent as a place. It was a beautiful, beautiful town. It's got a medieval side to it, with lots of 15th century huge big fortresses, castle, absolutely magnificent. And then it has an Italian feel, and basically what happened is the city largely got destroyed, and two brothers rebuilt it, and they loved Italian architecture and basically funded it. So you have this, part of it's very medieval, and part of it has a real Italian feel. So the church, etc., is just very Italian in feeling completely. As we drove there, the guy told us that basically, the Muscadet region is all this region around Nantes and all where we are. There's 13,000 hectares of vineyards in the area, and the Muscadet name originates from its musky taste, which was largely driven, as I understand it, from Dutch merchants who added things like nutmeg to it, which gave the wine that sort of taste. And the guide also tried to explain to us why it's called Muscadet, which is obviously pretty much after the name of the grapes and not the region. So you've got Bordeaux, you've got Champagne, and other wines and fortified wines are named after the region they come from, but not the case with Muscadet. And it seems to be largely because of the nature of the region, with lots of turmoil during the French Revolution, vineyards being damaged, it being largely wiped out by disease. It sort of had some resurgence as kind of a cheap drink in the 20th century, and then in the later part of the 20th century, vineyards started to really focus on a much more quality product, and I guess that's probably why. So it's never, kind of the region itself never had time to really build and establish its name as some of the others have done. So we then saw that on our way to Clisson, and I've already said Clisson was fantastic. So the Chateau de Clisson, which is the big castle, which really existed from the 15th century onwards. The Italian church is the Notre Dame, a beautiful, beautiful looking church. And then we strolled to the town. There's rivers going through it, very beautiful buildings, lots of people out on the river, kayaking. We eventually walked through and underneath the arches of the viaduct, which goes all the way to Nantes. And then we reboarded the bus, and we headed out towards what's called the La Chapelle-Hulen area. I think I pronounced that a bit Dutch-like, didn't it? And we stopped at a very beautiful chateau, the Chateau Casamichre. And this is the chateau dates back to the 1600s, and they are renowned for the Muscadet wine that they produce. So we toured a little bit. The owner told us a little bit about the vineyards. He told us a little bit about the chateau. He showed us through some old storage, with huge big drums, caskets of that right word of wine, although I'm not 100% sure that was really where they stored the wine, and that's more for show, because he did later start talking about, underneath the area, the sort of hall that we were talking to him, there was lots of storage and lots of barrels, and that's where the wine stored. So, but anyway, we got to see these very beautiful old barrels, and there was some wine tasting on with a Muscadet Chardonnay and a sparkling wine. And then we returned back to the ship, getting back sort of around about 6:30, and then we had dinner. And dinner this evening was a herring salad, some sautéed pork with a sort of chasseur-style sauce, potatoes and green beans, and then a Saint-Tropez pie, which was kind of like a sweet brioche with like a crème anglaise, I think it was in the middle. Very tasty, actually, very tasty indeed. And then after dinner there was a show with two guitarists, a male and a female, and they were singing songs which clearly the French travellers knew very well, but they were songs from Brittany. They were very entertaining, played guitars, sort of like a penny whistle thing, ukulele, got audience participation and really good fun. So I was mentioning earlier about how this ship, the Loire Princesse, can get up even when the river is very shallow. However, it's proving to be too shallow, and so we are not sailing tomorrow to our next destination. We were due to sail on, first of all, to at 8 o'clock in the morning to a place called Chalons-sur-Loire, and then later on the ship was then going to sail, when everyone went off on a guided walking tour of Angers, to our overnight stay, which was going to be in Bouchermaine. Now, that's not going to happen. What we're actually going to be doing tomorrow is we are going to do a little bit of sailing between 8 o'clock and sort of about noon, but we are going to then return back to Anciens and stay the night over here. But the excursions will be happening because it's just too narrow, and they explained the captain had been talking to the sort of overseer captain, the chief captain, in Strasbourg, which is the capital, which is the head office of CroisiEurope, and the decision was made that it's too risky for us to sail up to those various stops. So that's a pity. So we will be spending another night here, which for me is not too bad of a problem, because I didn't actually get a chance to go and explore the town here. So hopefully between all of those movements and the excursion, I'll also get a chance to take a little look at the town and some of the sites here. So that's really an update on terms of today. Very beautiful part of the countryside, a fascinating town, and of course time's going really quickly because tomorrow we head towards day 4. And so it's now the end of day 4, and today was spent in a place called Angers. As I mentioned, because the water further up the river is too shallow, largely because it's been quite dry, so the water near Angers is too shallow for us to sail up to with safety. We did a morning sailing, so we headed out sort of about just after 8 o'clock, got back about noon, so about 4 hours of sailing along the riverbanks, very pretty. And we did go a little bit up the river and then headed back and docked back where we had been. And then after lunch, we headed out on Tours. Lunch today was probably the only meal that I've had that I wasn't wild about. They had a leek tart, which is very nice indeed. Then there was some fish haddock, I think, with the lobster sauce, and I just wasn't particularly wild about it. And then there was a very delicious pineapple skewer, hot pineapple skewer with some coconut ice cream. It was very tasty indeed. Anyway, then it was time for excursions, and because we had to drive all the way to Angers, which was about a 45-minute drive, so not too far away, they changed around the way that they did excursions, and it didn't work as well. So the French and Spanish, or most of the French team and the Spanish team went in one coach, I think because the Spanish guide that has been with them, it must have been a day off or something, because she didn't go out with them today. So there was someone doing a combined French and Spanish group, And then there was the rest of the French and an English group. And the problem was it was a large group and it was very onerous and didn't really work, in my personal opinion, because everywhere we went, the guide would have to say it in French and then in English. So it really slowed things down. Also, the guide we had was very into detail. So probably if she had been a little bit more top line, it would have gone through a little bit quicker. So it was quite a long, drawn out excursion because of that. So hopefully tomorrow that will change. But anyway, we went to Angers, and a couple of very exciting things we saw. We went to Le Chateau de Angers, which is really more of a fortification. Some massive fortifications inside, some very beautiful chateaus, and very pretty inside, massive complex. And then what we went to see was what's known as the Apocalypse Tapestry. This is quite something. It's over 100 meters long, and it used to be a series of, I can't remember the exact number, but it's basically a series of sort of 8 meter by 13, or was it 6 meters by 13 meter stretches, these vast tapestries. Unfortunately, over time, it sort of fell out of favor, and it was actually cut up into smaller pieces. So each of the panels became sort of like smaller pieces, and it was a real pity because it's kind of destroyed this unbelievably phenomenal work of art, really. But you go into this room, the room was actually built in 1952, and it's hanging along the wall with an outline of where it used to be, but all the writing that used to be above each of the panels have gone. But there's still, I guess probably 80%, 75-80% of the tapestries are still there. So it's quite remarkable. The only problem is that the guide then proceeded to take us through all 100 meters, almost item by item on the tapestry, doing it in French, doing it in English, and it took an unbelievably long time, which I don't think was ideal. We then headed off to the cathedral, which was very impressive indeed, a very beautiful cathedral. And again, you can find pictures of those on the blog if you go to Tips for Travellers. Look for the CroisiEurope page, just search, you'll find a little search box there, search for CroisiEurope or search for Loire, and you'll find all various links to those various pictures. Anyway, we ended up coming back only at 6:30, and I think we probably could have easily saved an hour or more on that particular tour. So there wasn't a lot of time before dinner. For dinner this evening, we had what was described as meat and pastry, but it was kind of like it was like a terrine, really, in a pastry outing. It was absolutely delicious. And then for main was probably my second least successful appealing meal, but went down an absolute storm, I think, for most people, which was rabbit. It was rabbit with like a stuffing. It was the first time I've ever had rabbit, so that was interesting. Apparently rabbit's quite a popular dish in France. I didn't know that, but apparently it is, I was told. I've tried rabbit. It was very well done. It was very beautifully presented. Wasn't really my thing, but I've done it. Then we had the most delicious creme brulee. It was absolutely magnificent creme brulee. And then after that, after the dinner, there was the crew show, which was a whole series of various sketches, dance routines, etc. And certainly that went down a real treat, the crew show. And some of it, I think, is fairly consistent across the CroisiEurope boats, because the couple that I sat at the table with had mentioned one or two of the sketches and things which actually were done on this show as well, that they'd seen on other CroisiEurope boats. So maybe there's a couple of sketches which they know are popular, and they weave those through as crew move around and so on. So that was the day. Tomorrow is a very early start, and we have a whole day on the excursion to the chateau around the area, which is an included excursion, and I'll obviously talk much more about that tomorrow. And so it's day 5, and as I record this, it's just after 10:30, and we are currently cruising back towards Nantes, where we will be docking in a short while and overnight, ready for disembarkation tomorrow. So let me talk about the last day. The last day was a big day for everybody, really, because it has the included excursion. And the included excursion is a tour of 3 of the very significant chateaux, of which there are many, in the Loire area. And we set off at around about 8 o'clock in the morning. we only got back at about 6:30, so it's a long day. It was slightly longer than, probably about an hour and a half longer overall, maybe a little bit more, because obviously we couldn't sail all the way up towards Angers, which would have made it a little bit closer for the different chateaux. So let me talk about the chateau, because they were amazing. All three of them were just fantastic, and it really was a brilliant, brilliant day. So the first chateau we went to was the Chateau of Azay, and this is Renaissance architecture. In fact, when I saw it, I felt like I'd seen it before, so I suspect it's one of those classic chateaux that you see with very beautiful turrets and magnificent, magnificent architecture. But basically, in this chateau, which is actually being extensively renovated, so part of it was actually covered by scaffolding and being renovated, but still, if you go to the site, you'll still be able to see pictures of it. So if you go to tipsfortravellers.com, search Loire, and you'll find links to the various photographs. You'll see the bit that you can still see was very beautiful. So basically, the chateau has, over the centuries, been, restored. And basically what kept happening, as I explained, is each of the people went in, they would kind of restore it, do it, and then sort of spend all their money and then sort of have to sell it on. So no one actually who spent all the time really restoring it really enjoyed it. But the last Marquis, he was ruined by it. He eventually sold the estate at the end of the 19th century, and the French state acquired the chateau and part of the grounds in 1905, and since then it's obviously been open to the public. But it's a magnificent building, and you can go inside and tour it. You can go up a big grand staircase. You can look at some very beautiful rooms, including a room that was set aside for the royal apartment. So basically, during the sort of 16th and 17th century, is all these grand homes were expected to have somewhere that the king could come and stay as they sort of toured the country. And so you get to see the royal apartment, and it was actually used by Louis the 13th in 1619, and you get to see just quite magnificent stuff. Also, what's very interesting is one of the rooms has been decorated with these sort of mats, if you like. It's basically a traditional matting that was all over the walls in this video, which explains all about it. And that was actually called, if I remember correctly, the Biencourt or Biencourt Salon. I think that's the one that was called. But anyway, the Chateau of Azay, absolutely magnificent. We then headed off to Villandry, and this is magnificent. This for me was the highlight of the day. And basically Villandry had been around for a long time, and then early in the 1900s it was sort of a bit run down, and it originally years ago had very beautiful Renaissance gardens, which had all been ripped up and replaced with a more English style garden. But basically in 1906 the castle was bought by a Spanish man called Joaquim Cavallo, and he was a scientist, but he was very passionate about Villandry. He had the money as well. He set about restoring the castle, and then went about restoring the Renaissance gardens, and he used various literary sources, found actually when they did some architectural surveys of the lands, they could find basically where these gardens had been. And the gardens are absolutely magnificent. They're huge, absolutely huge, and altogether there are 5 or 6 gardens, including an ornamental garden which is close to the chateau, which really is remarkable. You've got woods you can stroll through, a very beautiful water garden, a sun garden, herb garden, a vegetable garden, and the maze, which is interesting because actually the maze, it doesn't have lots of dead ends. It's basically more of a labyrinth, I guess, than a maze. We didn't actually tour the villa, or the chateau, should I say, which looked pretty magnificent. And the reason, because we had lunch there, magnificent lunch, which was made with sort of vegetables and stuff grown in the garden. But Villandry was just absolutely stunning. And again, you can see all the pictures of that, and particularly the gardens, which I would sort of encourage you to take a look at. And the final place that we went to see was the Chateau Usse, and Chateau Usse is very fairy tale like, and when you actually hear the story about it, it becomes even more fairy tale like. So basically, the story is that when staying at Usse, the writer Charles Perrault, I think that's how you pronounce it, Perrault, in the 17th century, he stayed there, and he was very inspired by the look of the place, and that he eventually wrote Sleeping Beauty. So in the chateau, there's a whole section, if you climb up into the parapets, etc., dedicated to the story of Sleeping Beauty, and there's sort of various tableaux and stuff that represent that. But back in the main house, you can obviously tour the main house. Part of it you can't tour because the family, the owners, current owners, still live in it, but you can tour various parts of it. And what they do is there's quite a lot of displays of old clothes. Not old clothes as in old clothes, but beautiful costumes and things, I guess is probably a way of describing it. And apparently they have a massive collection of costumes, and they sort of rotate those around. You can basically walk through the different parts of the building, both the oldest part, which is more towards the 15th century, and then this part which is more belong to the 17th century. But really is quite magnificent. Then also close by is a very beautiful cathedral, which is for the estate. The thing which is also interesting is the gardens, or the terraces, because it's on quite a steep hill, so it's quite a big climb up. So it's all been terraced, obviously, so they could build these things. But the terraces and also the gardens were designed by Le Notre, who was the architect of the gardens of Versailles. But that was very magical and very beautiful place to visit. So those three chateaux were really made today a great day. Anyway, we headed back into the ship and got in about 6:30. 8 o'clock we sort of had a farewell drink, and then we had the gala dinner. And the gala dinner, the staff were all dressed up in very beautiful smart outfits with epaulets and everything, and we had a very nice meal indeed, and without a shadow of a doubt it was a masterpiece of French cuisine. So we had what I guess was foie gras, but it was sort of like a roasted foie gras. It was very nice. I like foie gras, so that was great. Then we had beef with artichokes and carrots and potato. Then we had cheese camembert, and then we had like a raspberry tart thing, very light, very beautiful. And also what they did this evening is had wines for each course, and there were very different wines that have been available during the rest of the cruise. So they kind of link the wines to the meal. It was a very nice meal indeed, very, very nice indeed. So then after that, there was the opportunity for people to sort of have dancing, etc. But of course, a lot of people head off to pack because tomorrow, for a lot of people, have relatively early starts. Like my pickup is 8:15. Other people sort of will be going around about at that time. So that's the last day of the trip. As I said, we're heading back to Nantes. We will be overnight, and tomorrow is the final day. What I will do is I will do a bit of a wrap up on the final day, and maybe just summarize a little bit about CroisiEurope and sort of some of the reasons that I've sort of gathered during the course of this trip about CroisiEurope, and some of the reasons that people may want to consider CroisiEurope, and if it's really kind of the right trip and cruise for you based on my experiences. And so, as I promised, I thought I would just sort of summarize a little bit about some of the whys one may want to cruise with CroisiEurope, based on sort of things I'd observed and also things I sort of learned along the way. So these are much more general things, because I think overall in the podcast I've probably given you a sense of what the Loire cruise itself is like, and I will also be doing a separate, much more detailed Tips for Travellers podcast on CroisiEurope, which will go into much more detail about who I think it's suitable for, tips for getting the most of the cruise and all that kind of stuff. But basically, here's a couple of things that struck me about why you might consider them. First of all, one of the things that I don't know if I spoke about a lot, but certainly is probably worth knowing, is that CroisiEurope have been going for 40 years. And they were established in 1976 by a guy called Gerard Schmitter. The family still own and run the business. And so they are the most experienced river cruise operator in Europe, with over 40 years experience. The other thing that's important, obviously this has been about the Loire cruise, but they have certainly the time that I did the cruise, over 44 ships. They've got the largest fleet in Europe, and so they have huge amounts of choice. So even if the Loire, having listened to the podcast, doesn't appeal, they do the major rivers like the Rhine, the Danube, they do the Seine, they do rivers in Hungary, they do rivers in Spain, they do the Douro in Portugal, as well as unusual ones like the Loire. They also do some cruises in Asia, like the Vietnam and Myanmar. So I think it's always pronounced, I'm not 100% sure, but they do the Irrawaddy in Myanmar. So they have lots of choice and lots of different types of river cruise ships to choose from, which is obviously, as you look at the Loire and you look at the Loire Princesse, if that's not the specific ship for you, they do have 43 other ships that you could consider. I said quite a few times, it's a value for money line. So if you're looking at river cruising and as you've looked at them, you've seen that they're quite expensive. Many of the cruise lines to river cruise are pretty expensive. So if you're looking for something, you want to try river cruising, you don't want to spend as much money as some of those. I mean, it's not dirt cheap, but it's definitely value for money. This is what CroisiEurope is, and they're probably unique in that respect. They're not as plush as the 5-star premium lines, but as I think I've probably communicated, they're comfortable, they're welcoming. They won't have all the bells and whistles like you won't get, as I mentioned, choice for dinner. But if there's something on the menu you don't like and you see it on the screen, overnight or in the morning, if you let them know, they will swap it out for something. But you won't get things like bathrobes and face cloths, and there's just little bits and pieces like that. But it's certainly very comfortable and smart. It is an all-inclusive. As I mentioned, you've got your accommodation, you've got your beverages, your beer, your wine, your spirits, bottled water, soft drinks, coffee, tea, all that sort of stuff, and all your meals, which is definitely French orientated. You get your free Wi-Fi, all that kind of stuff. What you don't get, which a lot of the other lines do, is you don't get excursions. As I mentioned on the Loire, there was that great all-day included excursion of the Chateau. So check, if you're looking at cruises, what is included. But you probably have to buy excursions separately or self-tour. Although I think in reality, based on certainly, and again, you need to look at the destinations very carefully, would be my tip. Like on the Loire, I'm not sure there's a lot of great places to stop to self-tour, because the places that you really want to see were a short distance away, so you kind of need the excursion to do it. But certainly that is one option. And if you look at some of the other cruises, like the Danube, for example, you're stopping in fairly major cities right there where you could probably self-tour quite comfortably. You do get limited amount of entertainment, and you do get port talks. Probably on some of the other lines, you get more port talks in a little bit more detail. So it's kind of that balance between, obviously, there's things that they do to try and make sure that they stay within value for money, but it is, largely all inclusive. And I must say, I took money with me, and I spent a couple of euros on buying some bottles of water when I was out and about, and I left a gratuity, because actually the other thing that's not included in the price is gratuity. Some of the other lines make it clear that gratuity is not expected, and at the sort of price you pay, that's probably fair enough. On those premium lines, I didn't feel any need or pressure to do gratuities. But here, as I mentioned, we were given a survey to do and also an envelope for gratuities. So the only thing I actually spent money on was gratuities and a few euros buying water when we were out. That's literally what I bought, nothing else. So the great thing about that is when you're heading before on a river cruise with CroisiEurope, again, like many other river cruises, but certainly before you go, and particularly if you bought the excursions, that's going to be the cost of your holiday, and that's going to be it, other than budgeting for gratuities, or obviously if you want to buy various souvenirs when you're out and about. All the cabins have a view. They're pretty comfortable. Again, I've done a video of the room and a video of the ship, so obviously you can take a look at that and see just exactly what I mean by it's comfortable. And the view and that kind of stuff. It's got all the usual things, air conditioning, you've got satellite TV channels, you've got hair dryers, all that sort of stuff, and you have those views. And certainly on the Loire Princesse, we actually even had a balcony. So you definitely have very comfortable cabins. Again, they're not overly plush. The beds are perfectly comfortable and all that kind of stuff. So that's definitely what you get. I mean, the ships are small, but they're places to mix and react and relax. So, you do have those facilities. I've already spoken about the lounge bar, the souvenir shop, the sun deck, so you've got all those kind of places. It's pretty intimate. You've got, on our Loire Princesse was only 94 guests, but it varies from about 100 up to, I think the biggest ship they've got can take it to about 180. So it depends on where you're going in the ship design, but there's a high crew to passenger ratio. So even though you're going on a value for money line, there is a high crew to passenger ratio. So, obviously it depends on the individuals and stuff, because you can have, I've only experienced the one ship, so I don't know the level of service across all the ships, but I'm guessing that it's probably the same, because I assume there's kind of training and a certain sort of CroisiEurope way of doing things. But yeah, that high crew passenger ratio, you get to pretty much know everybody. You'll recognise all the crew, they'll recognise you, and obviously you can build a rapport with them and they get to know your needs. You got that French cuisine. I thought the food was very good. I think I mentioned there was only one meal that I didn't like of the whole lot. And one dish, sorry, not even one meal, one dish. You get that 3-course meal, so it's great value for money. And I thought the food was very good. And they do claim to work, well, they don't claim, they do work with Michelin star chefs in terms of designing their overall menus. And talking to other people, what I learned is the menus do seem to differ by the ships. So certainly the menus we had on the Loire Princesse were very different to what other people had. And that's largely because the ships tend to reflect the region they're traveling in. But certainly, you had plenty of food, definitely plenty of food, and you get all the wine that goes with it. Everyone speaks English, but you have a multilingual crew. The predominant languages are French and English. But as I mentioned, there was a big Spanish contingent that had a specific Spanish hostess. And the other thing is, and although I didn't talk about it, but certainly, reading their materials, they do make quite a long point about being very eco-aware, being as friendly as possible in terms of saving water, not dumping water in the rivers, having proper waste disposal systems, and working within all the pollution controls. Europe is quite strict on that anyway, and they certainly seem to have that as part of their whole kind of company ethos. So I think if you're looking to try river cruising and you're worried a little bit about the prices of some of the cruise lines that you might have looked at, I think CroisiEurope is definitely worth considering if to give it a go, and without spending a lot of money. And of course, if you don't like spending a lot of money on your holidays, or you want to do multiple holidays, you probably could do 2 river cruises with CroisiEurope for the price of 1 river cruise on some of the premium lines. So it's certainly, that's something to think about if you want to look at making your money stretch further. And certainly based on my experience, I found them very friendly, very welcoming. The food was good. The cabin was great. The tours, the tours were great. I'm not sure the tours would have been any worse or any better. The only thing was, depending on the split up with the dual language thing, that it can slow things down sometimes versus some of the cruises which are all, say, in English. So some of the cruise lines I've been on before have been basically only in English. So if that's something that puts you off, then maybe CroisiEurope's not ideal for you. But certainly the mix of cultures, if you want to go to Europe, you're going to mix with different cultures. And there was Spanish people, there was French people, there was people from Australia, people from New Zealand, etc. So if that appeals to you, and certainly if you're going to travel in Europe and be surrounded by Europeans, that's probably not a bad thing at all. But certainly CroisiEurope is much more multinational, multilingual than many of the other cruise lines that are working the rivers of Europe today. So that's overall thoughts in terms of observations, things about CroisiEurope and the Loire cruise. It was a great cruise. I had a great time, met some great people, probably ate too much, saw some amazing sights. And I really was very impressed with the Loire. It was a beautiful river, beautiful scenery, and just being on the river when it's so quiet. That's what I've said to people is, unlike some other rivers I've been on where sometimes you're docking up and you've got 3 river boats, side by side and more in front of you, and you're walking through river boats to get out in Vienna or in Budapest or whatever. Here you are the only thing on the river. There's little pleasure boats, and there's no commercial traffic. So it was a great cruise from that perspective. It was very peaceful being out on the river. It was a very busy, packed schedule. Saw lots, very beautiful things to see, beautiful vineyards, beautiful scenery, amazing chateau, really interesting historical towns. So I came back with great photographs, saw great things, and really had a great time. Genuinely had a great time. And so those are sort of my thoughts for now on the Loire River Live. And as I mentioned, if you visit the site tipsfortravellers.com, if you search CroisiEurope, you'll find loads of other stuff, videos that I've made, overview of the whole cruise. I've done a little thing about CroisiEurope and the room tour, and you'll find all sorts of other things, other podcasts when they come, and links to all the photographs if you want to take a look at what it is like on the Loire River. And also in the show notes, I'll put links to a lot of that stuff. So in the show notes, you'll certainly get links, and I would encourage you to take a look at all the photographs and the videos, because that may sort of, it paints the picture as well as just the words. And if you're considering a Loire cruise, the only place you can do it with is CroisiEurope. So until next time, that's all I've got for you. Remember, if you're listening to this for the first time, thanks very much. Please subscribe. If you're a regular listener, please give a rating and a review and give me some feedback. And you can do that by going to Tips for Travellers. Please remember that Travellers is spelled with 2 L's. tipsfortravellers.com/iTunes TFT if you're an iTunes user, Stitcher TFT, TuneIn TFT, or Google Play TFT if that's your preferred way of getting podcasts.